Detail. Joining me to do that, the Conservative commentator Albie Amankona. Albie, good morning.
Good morning, Rosie.
Has the Prime Minister made the right decision, boosting particularly the car industry by saying, right, we're going to push some of those deadlines back, which I think some people thought were extremely ambitious anyway, but by another 5 years, just to provide a little bit of breathing room, particularly for the industry that so far has been hit hardest by tariffs?
I think he is making the right decision about relaxing some of the green net zero targets around electric vehicles. I find it interesting that a lot of the papers are talking about this as some sort of fight back against tariffs, rather than it being a fight back against the net zero policies that were introduced by the previous government, that were agreed to as well by pretty much every party in Parliament at the time. So I find it interesting that it's being the framing of it is as a fight back to the tariffs and
You're
not
skeptical.
really a fight back. Exactly.
Do you think this is an excuse, actually, to give a bit more leeway on something that seemed very challenging?
I think it's a bit of an excuse. We obviously got the news from Vauxhall's Vauxhall's owner earlier on this year that they were going to close their factory near Luton because of some of the net zero targets. We also heard from Rishi Sunak a couple of years ago that he was relaxing net zero targets. So this isn't a new thing. There seems to be a more secular trend, which seems to be the erosion of commitments to net zero from not just the Conservative Party. We heard Kelly Badenoch a couple of weeks ago at the Centre for Policy Studies completely say she wants to ditch net zero totally. Now we're hearing from Keir Starmer that as a result of these tariffs, we're going to renege on some of our net zero targets for EVs, reducing the fine that's paid to cut the car makers pay if they don't manufacture enough EVs within line with the targets that they've been set by the government, and other measures as well. So I think it's just a trend that keeps on trending.
The Prime Minister wants a calm, quite, I guess, measured approach to Trump's tariffs, hasn't sort of announced any immediate retaliation, says he's still looking out for a deal with the US. Do you think he's handling this right?
I think he has handled this probably the best way that he could. I don't think the UK was really in the same position as some countries to put on retaliatory tariffs like we're seeing with Canada and China, for example. The UK actually, compared to, the rest of Europe, is in a remarkably good position after what is actually quite a bad position for the entire world. If you think that the EU has got tariffs of 20%, the UK has only got tariffs of 10%, some people would argue that's a Brexit benefit. Keir Starmer seems pretty convinced, actually, that this is not a phase. He's actually going to say today that this is not a phase, and that the world has changed and that tariffs are here to stay.
Yeah.
So that could signal some difficulty for the global economy in the months and years ahead.
I'm sure. Well, we'll hear more from the Prime Minister later on today when he makes that speech from the West Midlands. Let's look at what might happen in the health service. The front page of the Daily Telegraph, the Times are reporting on this as well. This idea to have door-to-door NHS services. So people turning up to prevent you, I guess the assumption is, ending up going to hospital. What's the plan? Is it a good idea?
So this is a plan for a new fleet of community health workers to be going around I think between the top 10 and 20% most deprived places in the UK to basically deliver healthcare services at home. They're going to be called CHUIs. I'm not sure about the acronym. Maybe it'll stick, maybe it won't stick. But essentially what these people will do is they will do a job quite similar to what family doctors doing health calls did, probably back before you and I were born, Rosie, where essentially healthcare would be delivered at the home, where it could be delivered at the home, as opposed to people having to go to GP surgeries. Now, this is in response to really increasing levels of A&E usage that we've seen for what we might deem as things that people go to A&E for illnesses that aren't really worthy of going to A&E for. And actually, in the areas where this has been rolled out, I think it's seen up to a 6 or 7% decrease in people going to A&E, which is a pretty huge decrease. And this is actually inspired by, I think, what the health service does in Brazil, where actually this has been very successful. And there's a thought that once this is rolled out to all the areas where they want to roll it out to, it could cost just £300 million and have an impact on A&E admissions, reducing them by almost 10 or 20%. So it really could be quite revolutionary if it works. The question is, will it work, and will the health secretary be able to implement it properly?
Yeah. Well, do you think there might be any barriers to that? I mean, it looks like in Brazil it's been brilliant where they've piloted it. In Westminster and in around Pimlico in central London, they've had success. And the change really is that you've got people visiting ahead of where there might be a problem to better identify them before it gets to that emergency situation. I mean, it sounds like a good idea.
What I think we will have to be careful of it is Brazil and the UK are obviously very different countries, and the people in Brazil and the UK will have very different healthcare needs. Obviously, in the UK, a lot of people that end up in A&E are older people, pensioners who might have had a fall as a result of our ageing population and shrinking labour force. The demographics in Brazil are very different. Equally, what works in Pimlico might not work in Preston. You know, SW1 is a very different part of the country than lots of the parts of the country where we see the worst healthcare outcomes, notably the northeast of England. So what works in parts of London, what works in some countries in South America, might not necessarily work in the entirety of the United Kingdom. So I think the health secretary is going to have to be careful if he thinks this is going to be the silver bullet to people going to A&E for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, I think it probably inevitably won't be a silver bullet. As part of, as they've talked about many times, they're having to do multiple things to reform the NHS at the same time, which hopefully will have a better impact on how we all are. And the big change, actually, Albie, from the new government is a stress on preventative care in health rather than dealing with problems. It's sort of stopping the problems happen in the first place.
We've been talking about preventive healthcare for a long time. The last government spoke about preventative healthcare. The question is the NHS and the health department in a position to stop what is essentially feels like firefighting with the NHS every year since the pandemic, really? And I think probably what the health secretary is hoping is that with this huge cash injection that the NHS has had and the NHS waiting list finally coming down, perhaps they can get out of firefighting mode and get into, maybe for lack of a better phrase, weather forecasting mode, where they can try and predict where things are happening, solve those problems before they happen, and then get the NHS on a better footing. The question is, will they be able to do it? I wish them the very best of luck, because not many other governments have had much luck with sorting out the NHS over the past 5 years.
Yeah, well, the health secretary keeps talking about reduced waiting lists for the last few months. We'll see if that trend continues. Obviously, big changes to come with the scrapping of NHS England, the body that runs the NHS, to sort of merge it with the Department of Health. So big changes afoot. This is an interesting piece inside The Times, written by the Home Affairs editor, about what the punishment should be for young knife crime offenders. Well, this sort of citizens panel of members of the public, kind of cross-section of the population, said that people want serious young offenders to be forced to join the army. So if you're convicted of a knife crime, instead of sort of go to prison, you'd be forced instead to do national service. Are you in agreement with the citizens panel?
I think it's an interesting idea. What they are trying to solve is the fact that there is a perception, and perhaps it's true, that people who are committing some crimes, perhaps knife crimes, people that are involved in gang culture, for example, are not actually scared to go to prison whatsoever. And so this citizens panel, which was organised by the Prison Reform Trust, which was a charity led by Lord Timpson, of course, runs Timpson's, where lots of people might go and get their keys cut and shoes fixed and things like that. Now he's the prisons minister. I think this work has been taken over by David Gauke, the former Conservative Justice Secretary. But there seems to be a perception that people seem to think people would be a little bit more scared if you get sentenced to do something called national service, which is joining the Army and Navy, Air Force, something like that. And then they're also going to come out with qualifications, a good routine, and so they're less likely to reoffend. I have to say, I think this is quite a good idea, but I wonder what this means for the Conservatives, whose last plan when they were, well, really in government, one of their big policies was what they wanted to introduce national service for the entire young population, essentially. How would that work if you're going to be using national service as a punishment for people who commit crimes like knife crime, but then you also want it compulsory. For the entire compulsory for the whole young population?
How credible do you think that idea was? I mean, it came at a time in the election campaign where things were looking quite desperate, I think it's fair to say, for the Conservatives.
Look, I think it's a credible idea. There are lots of countries that do similar things to national service. If we look at a lot of the Nordic countries, if we look at a country like Israel, for example, that there are plenty of parts of the world that do these national service schemes. They have really great outcomes for young people. The problem was, I think, with the announcement of that policy is how it was announced. It wasn't announced particularly enthusiastically. There wasn't really any plan behind it. They hadn't really spoken to anyone in the military about it because the military were very surprised about it. And it just came out of nowhere in the middle of what was already a very bad election campaign. So it fell flat on its face. That doesn't mean that national service for all young people wouldn't be a bad idea, but it's got to be sold to the public and specifically to young people in a way that people actually feel they're going to get a benefit out of it, so people are in favour of it, not in the rubbish way that Rishi Sunak sold it.
There was a bit of mismanagement of expectations, and young people suddenly thought they would all be sort of drafted to join the army, which wasn't exactly the same.
Exactly.
Bear Grylls has caused a bit of a stir. He said tap water is terrible. Why? And I think the water body authorities, the drinking water inspectorate, are particularly unhappy.
Bear Grylls, what do you like, Bear Grylls? Always causing trouble, it seems, since he left his position as the chief scout. So this was actually a part of a commercial deal that Bear Grylls has been involved with a water filter company, where he basically says, when he's trying to flog these water filters to people, that tap water is terrible, and that the chemicals that they put in tap water in order to make it cleaner and safer for people to drink are really toxic. Things like chlorine are toxic. Things like fluoride are toxic. It sounds a bit like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. when he's talking about that. And essentially he's saying that tap water is really bad for you. And the way that you can solve it is by buying one of these water filters that he's paid, this water filter company has paid him to say this. And this is difficult for a number of reasons, not least because this is a man who's famous for drinking things like elephant dung, urine, juice, and his own juice, actually, urine himself, from a bottle. I remember seeing it on television. And then also the scientific basis behind what he's saying is actually complete nonsense. And you've got scientists from Cranfield University, a top university in the UK, essentially saying everything that Bear Grylls is saying is rubbish. Yeah. So that's the problem. Yes, but he's trying to sell his water filters, Albie. He's trying to sell his water filters. He's got to sell those water filters. Final thing I want to ask you about, and my opinion keeps changing on this story. This is the surfer who was rescued. His life was saved by the RNLI. He was brought out of the water unconscious. He was then airlifted to hospital. And if anyone's known anyone in a major accident, well, obviously they need to look after you and get access to you quickly. And they cut his wetsuit. And afterwards, he put a fundraising message online saying, on Monday, I got hit by a surfboard and suffered a blackout in the water. I had to get airlifted. Unfortunately, for safety precautions, they cut my wetsuit off me. Could you please donate to help me to get a new suit and get back to the water to do the thing I love? Well, a lot of people were pretty miffed that he dared to ask. They were. I have to say, I feel a bit sorry for this guy. So he set up this fundraiser to retrieve some money to buy a new wetsuit, which is going to cost him £350. I have to say, I think that's quite an expensive wetsuit, but I don't know how much wetsuits cost, but it seems quite expensive for a wetsuit. For me, now for me, if something like that happened, I would easily be able to buy a new wetsuit for £350. Now, if someone is in a position where surfing or doing whatever he does in the water in Cornwall near Newquay is very important, and he needs a wetsuit, and one has been destroyed because his life was saved, and he's thankful for that, and he needs to get another one. I don't think it's cheeky to try and raise funds to buy a new wetsuit without first raising funds for the RNLI. Everyone is thankful for the job that people at the RNLI and all the emergency services do. But ultimately, it is their job to do that. They are already paid to do that. We pay our taxes to pay these men and women to do their jobs. So I don't always like this sort of, if one of the emergency services does a good thing for us, what we've got to do is all raise money for them through GoFundMe. Yes. That's not really how it works. So I've got nothing against this gentleman for raising £350 to buy a wetsuit if that's what he wants to do. And I think that people need to get off their high horses.
Do you know what? Ryan Nile really needed you, Albie, to weigh in the comments and make that case for him, because quite the opposite happened. Lots of people sort of piled in and said, it beggars belief people are giving money to a self-centred human. How much did the air ambulance cost? I think you need a reality check. Well, he then updated his post to say he wants to thank the air ambulance and other people. He's full of gratitude, and he was then donated or given a brand new website by another company in Newquay, and said all the rest of the money raised is going to go to the air ambulance. But Albie, it's a ridiculous online row. I think it's in the paper this morning. Thank you so much, Albie.